So, everybody, we've now got a presentation from Jim Sykes, who's the Managing Director of AMS, Alexander Mann Solutions. He's going to be looking at evaluating and addressing the scarce talent. The topic of conversation is about how many people are leaving organisations at the moment, and people are deciding to do different vocations, and recruitment is a very buoyant marketplace at the moment. So lots of organisations are severely impacted and challenged and can't recruit enough people. So this is going to be a fascinating insight from one of the world's leading recruiting support organisations on how to get this right. So we'll have a recording to start with on this session, and then Jim will be joining us live for the Q&A. So please make sure you get your questions into the system as soon as possible, so we can have a very lively Q&A ahead of lunch. Excellent. Roll VT.
Good afternoon, and it's an honour to be presenting to you today at HRCoreLAB. I'm Jim Sykes, and I'm Sector Managing Director at AMS, responsible for our products, services and thought leadership within both our pharmaceutical and life sciences, as well as our professional services sector. I've worked in talent acquisition for more than 20 years, of which 16 of those have been with AMS. For those of you that don't know AMS, we are a global total workforce solutions firm founded in 1996. We enable organizations to thrive in an age of constant change by building, reshaping and optimizing workforces. I've recently published a white paper on the topic of scarce talent with a particular focus on the pharmaceutical and life sciences sector. While scarce talent has been a particular challenge for the pharma life sciences sector for the last few years, it's certainly now a challenge for all sectors. So I hope our learnings here are going to be beneficial for you all. But let's start by looking more broadly at the talent challenges that I think we're all facing today. The last 2 years have been profoundly challenging for all of us, both personally and professionally. I could talk at length about the challenges that COVID has thrown at us and the achievements that we as HR and talent leaders and practitioners have made in the face of those challenges. But it doesn't feel like we've even had time to step back and reflect, as now, at the point when it feels we may finally be emerging from the COVID crisis, we're hitting what has to be the most exceptional set of circumstances in many of our careers. We will each be facing challenges specific to our own sectors. At pharma and life sciences, we're dealing with heightened commercial pressure from patent cliffs and generic medicines. We're seeing a huge growth and shift in focus towards emerging markets. We're constantly navigating mergers and acquisitions, and we're prioritizing a strategic shift towards digital health, driven by AI, machine learning, patient access, and patient centricity. On top of our own sector challenges, there are a number of talent challenges that I'm sure are occupying all of us today. Let me share with you a few that I think are particularly key. And let's start with scarce talent. There are almost 17 million open positions in the United States today. This means almost 1 in 9 jobs today are vacant. The challenge in Europe is less severe, but it is significant. Competition for talent is fierce, and competition for scarce skills, such as digital skills, for example, is yet more fierce. And on top of that, skills requirements are changing at a faster rate than ever before. According to Gartner, the total number of skills required for a single job is increasing by 10% year over year. Meanwhile, over half of the total skills needed for an average role are new, and they're displacing old ones. Over 30% of skills needed to do a job in 2017 are obsolete today. And then, of course, we have the huge challenge of talent retention. The Great Resignation, I realize that term isn't liked by everyone, but call it what you will, the Great Resignation will continue to drive increasing levels of staff turnover, requiring, of course, increasing levels of external hiring, compounding the talent scarcity challenge that I've just mentioned. And these challenges are now driving a significant level of inflation. According to recent data from FT.com, workers who shifted jobs between August and October of last year had a median wage increase of 5.1% versus 3.7% for those who stayed put. Inflation's obviously driving up our wages and payroll costs, but it's also driving an imbalance between existing employees and new hires. And that imbalance in turn is likely to drive up employee turnover yet more. Alongside these challenges, we have the continuing shift towards globalization. As well as talent demand shifting globally, we're starting to see a much more pragmatic approach to above market hiring. So the ability to hire talent wherever that talent may be. It's a great development, I think, for talent acquisition leaders, but it's a challenge which presents some real complexity to deliver upon. Now, if these challenges weren't, let me remind you that in a number of countries today, talent acquisition professionals are more in demand than software engineers, and who would ever have thought that 2 years ago? So let's talk about scarce talent or scarce skills. Many of those challenges that I mentioned before are all related to the same thing. Demand in general is greater than supply. Skills requirements are changing faster than ever before. Companies are struggling to retain the talent that they already have, and inflation is going to drive up competition yet further. There is no silver bullet to these challenges. There are some big strategic imperatives that I believe companies must embrace, and I'll come on to those at the end of this presentation. And there are some tactical steps that will absolutely help in the short to medium term. But what do we actually mean by scarce talent? Well, anecdotally, we probably all have a view as to what constitutes scarce talent within our own sectors and our own companies. Within pharma, we would typically view scarce talent as scientific or medical roles. And I'm guessing across all skills, across all sectors, we could agree that digital skills are scarce. But equally, we could well see skill shortages for manufacturing roles in remote locations, delivery drivers, care assistants, hospitality workers. Scarce talent clearly isn't limited to niche skills. It's simply the roles for which demand outstrips supply. Before we talk about tactics to address talent shortages, it's really important that we define exactly where we see those shortages within our own organizations. And this is the methodology that I created for the white paper, a methodology that will work for any sector using data that should be easily available from your applicant tracking systems. In this analysis, we are categorizing our hiring by function, and then we're using 3 key data points: the average time to hire, the average agency usage, and then the total number of hires per function. Importantly, we're comparing our data sets against our corporate average, or in the case of this white paper, against our global averages. What I've done here is I've then plotted the data in a bubble graph, with the x-axis on the bottom demonstrating the time to hire by function compared to our corporate average, the y-axis on the side demonstrating our agency usage by function, again, against our corporate average. And of course, the size of the bubble demonstrates the total number of hires for each of those functions. So in this example that you can see on the screen, bubble A would donate a function for which the time to hire was 5 days longer than the average, for which agency usage was 15% higher than the average. And it's a function for which we hired more than any other, 800 hires. In this example, if we wanted to choose a function to prioritize for our tactical interventions, then this function A would be a really good bet. The white paper we published was specific to pharma and life sciences. So I'm not going to spend too much time on the results, as I know they won't be relevant for many of you today. But let me share a few high-level results just to give you some content to add to the methodology that I just shared. For our white paper, we looked at around 30,000 placements that we made for our outsourcing clients within the pharma and life sciences sector in more than 80 countries around the world. Those 30,000 placements were made in something like an 18-month period. If we apply this methodology against those 30,000 placements, we get some really interesting results. Now, as I think I mentioned before, within the pharma sector, we typically think of medical and scientific talent as the most scarce. And I would have assumed that medical affairs would have been right up in the upper right-hand quadrant of our chart. those hires for which agency usage and time to hire are the highest. But that's not the case. Whilst our circa 2,100 medical affairs hires are in the upper right-hand quadrant, the agency usage is actually only 1.6% higher than the average, and the time to hire is just marginally higher, 0.8 days higher than our global average. Research and development, so scientific roles, is pretty interesting too. We can see a big increase in time to hire, so about 11 days higher than the average, but agency usage is actually lower than the average by about 2.5%. What really stands out in this chart for me is commercial hiring, sales and marketing. I would have absolutely assumed prior to doing this research that these roles are amongst the least scarce. But as you can see, the 7,900 commercial hires that we made over the last 18 months took on average 1.7 days longer than average and incurred 2.4% more agency usage. Now, given time to hire for commercial functions is critical when it comes to new drug launches, and given that the commercial functions are second largest function, this data showed us that we needed new strategies when it came to hiring for commercial functions. Now, hiring in more than 80 countries around the world, we naturally see variances in average time to hire and agency utilization country by country. Let me give you a few examples. If you're hiring pharma talent in Malta, then be warned, it's the country in which we've seen the longest time to hire and the highest agency usage in the world. If you're ramping up in Kazakhstan or Sri Lanka, you may well face a similar challenge. Both of those are countries where hiring takes almost 50% longer than average, and in which agency usage can be up to 5 times higher than average. But given those 3 countries account for just 50 of our 30,000 hires, we can be pretty comfortable that the challenge posed is fairly immaterial. This chart instead looks at the top 15 major markets by volume. Our analysis shows that of the top 15 countries by hiring volume, only 2 stand out as having above average agency usage. The first is China, where agency usage is about 5% greater, and the second is the United Kingdom, with about a 3% increase above average. Whilst the UK has a below average time to hire, China averages 2 days above the average. So, as you can see in the upper right-hand quadrant, taking into account all of these metrics, the natural conclusion is that of all of the markets in the world with significant hiring volumes, China is the toughest when it comes to pharmaceutical and life science hiring. And then finally, let's take a look at potentially the most interesting charts. These are the functions by country that represent the most scarce talent in the life sciences sector. And there are a few examples here that really stand out. Medical affairs hiring in China is likely to require the greatest amount of agents. In our analysis, 20% higher than the global average. And medical affairs hiring in China, average time to hire averages circa 3 days longer than the average. When it comes to time to hire, commercial hiring in Denmark is amongst the longest globally at about 18 days longer than the global average. And there are a number of other outliers you can see. Another example would be commercial hiring in Austria, which on average takes 6 days longer and 7% higher than average agency usage. Now, again, I appreciate that the sector-specific information that I'm sharing may not be relevant for many of you, but I really do hope that this data helps to bring to life how your existing data can be utilized to inform where you may have specific scarce talent challenges within your own businesses. Addressing these challenges is going to require focus, investment, and effort. So rather than misdirect that effort, it's essential that you have some data to get past the myths into the reality. So let's talk about the tactical approaches we can take to tackle the scarce talent challenges once we've identified them. As I mentioned before, there is no silver bullet, but there are, I think, 3 approaches that will be essential. In thinking about candidate centricity for the white paper, I reached out to our recruiters within the sector and asked them to give me examples of where they felt they'd been able to influence a hiring manager to change the parameters of a role to better enable us to hire scarce talent. I had lots of great responses back from the team, examples of where we have been able to change the role location or move from a fixed location to a virtual location. I had examples of where we've been able to influence the remuneration, of course, for a particular role. And lots of examples of where we had influenced managers to consider a broader range of candidate experience, perhaps influencing managers to consider candidates from different therapeutic backgrounds or even from different sector backgrounds. And this is, of course, exactly what we should be aspiring to achieve, elevating our recruiters to become talent advisors, able to proactively influence the parameters of a role, not just advise on changes to the role after we've been searching for candidates for a month without success. As well as seeking to adapt roles for our scarce talents, we should seek to adapt our go-to-market approach too. I've been talking for years about the need to segment our recruitment brands in order to tailor our messaging for specific types of talent. It's naive to think that your generic employee value proposition is differentiated enough to be compelling for all candidates. We need candidate value propositions, or maybe we call them talent value propositions, and they need to be tailored appropriately for the talent segments that we're targeting. We also need to be proactive. Let's stop investing in building talent pools for all of our forecasted hiring. Let's use the analysis we looked at before to inform where we should invest in talent pools, and then let's do it properly. Let's engage proactively with the talent in those pools. Let's ask the business for sponsors who can engage with us. Let's see if we can hire in advance of roles becoming available, and let's build an authentic voice in the market that talks specifically to the scarce talent segments that we're targeting. In order to really understand how to secure scarce talent, we need to have tailored market insights at our fingertips. Market insights have proved to be a game changer for our recruiters and sourcers around the world. And by way of example, imagine the following. Before your recruiter, and ideally your sourcer, meet with your hiring managers to discuss your hiring manager's requirements, how much more consultative would that meeting be if they were able to present a view of the competitive nature of hiring, so the demand, and the availability of talent in the market, the supply? If we wish to influence the location of a role or even the salary being offered, how much more effective would it be if we had true insight into where the best talent is located around the world and the average remuneration packages that that talent is on today? And then before allowing your teams to post a role to external channels, wouldn't it be valuable to look at historical insights to understand how you've hired that talent before? If 90% of your historical hires for a particular role have come from internal talent or through employee referrals, wouldn't you want to focus your energy and frankly your investment on those channels first? Effective market insight used to be a rare luxury, something we invested in when we were under pressure or when we were being pushed by the business for more insight. Whilst it's absolutely not yet a commodity, it is easily accessible, affordable, and it's an invaluable investment. I'm sure, like me, you will also appreciate that sourcing tools and techniques are critical. And I'm sure, like me, you will have seen this huge evolution in this space over the last couple of years. Rather than talking about the evolution of sourcing and the evolution of sourcing tools, let me instead make a couple of points here that I feel really strongly about. Firstly, I'd like to touch upon media. I feel media channels have become almost frowned upon over the last couple of years, and I think that's naive. Where we don't have a scarcity of talent, where supply is actually greater than demand, we should absolutely be using media channels to attract talent. We need to focus our passive, proactive sourcing efforts on those roles that really require it. And maybe this sounds obvious, but I've spoken with many business leaders who seem to think that the best talent is always going to be passive, and that's simply not the case. Few of us have the capacity or the investment to direct passive headhunting approaches towards every single role that we are hiring for. The second point I wanted to make is around sourcing tools. There are some amazing sourcing tools in the marketplace, and new tools are being released every week with bigger and bolder claims about the use of artificial intelligence, stack and rank, etc., etc. None of these tools are perfect, but they're absolutely all better than nothing. We need to pick a tool, we need to back a tool, and then we need to institutionalize it within our teams and our talent acquisition functions. That said, ideally, we wouldn't invest a fortune in integrating that tool in case it becomes outdated in a couple of years. My personal view is that the best tools are those tools that will enable us to almost plug and play without huge upfront costs. So, we have spoken about the tactical interventions for scarce talent. Let me finish now by painting a picture of the strategic interventions, the strategic imperatives that I think progressive HR leaders should be focused on. All of us today will be focused on the aspects that you can see at the bottom of the screen. All critically important, but they're table stakes. Fulfillment, diverse hiring, stakeholder experience, time to hire, cost, flexibility and scalability, quality of hire, again, all critically important, but they're table stakes. These are the minimum expectations that our business leaders should have of us as talent acquisition experts. I'm really excited about the areas that you can see above the table stakes on the screen. So in order to bring this to life, let's imagine for a second what great could look like. And let me bring this to life with a hypothetical example. Let's think of a company that we're going to call Pharma Inc. Pharma Inc. takes a skills-based approach to all things talent. They have an integrated talent leader who sits on the HR leadership team and oversees their entire talent strategy, whether that's demand planning, internal talent management, L&D, or talent acquisition. Pharma Inc. is able to plan the skills that their business will require in the short, the medium, and the long term. They've also mapped all of their existing talents and skills so they know where they have immediate gaps and where those gaps will widen in time. With this insight, they can set a learning and development strategy to plug those gaps internally with a real focus on upskilling, reskilling, and of course, retaining their amazing talent for as long as possible. These efforts mean that the talent acquisition function is going to place more internal candidates, and the external hiring profile is going to be at a lower level than their competitors. They can focus more than their competitors do on entry-level talent and early careers talent. Frankly, they can focus more of their attention and their efforts on hiring for potential. The talent acquisition function within Pharma Inc. is empowered, of course, by market insight. They're able to advise the business where future skills can be found, and they're able to tailor their EVP specifically to those skills areas that are in demand. They focus their pipelining efforts on skills, and only those skills that they know are going to be in demand in the medium and the long term. Now, Pharma Inc., of course, understands that the long-term success of their business relies on not just hiring job-ready candidates, but hiring the talent with the greatest potential to develop, to reskill, and to upskill in the future. They assess candidates for cognitive agility. They place less effort, less emphasis on years of experience, and as such, they're radically shifting the diversity of their organizations through their external hiring efforts. And of course, Pharma Inc. has a progressive approach to external talent acquisition. The function looks after all hiring, whether it's permanent, fixed-term contracts, whether it's contractors or gig workers. This, in my mind, is the talent function of the future, and this is exactly how companies will win and retain the best talent. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Jim. That was absolutely superb. Some incredible insight there. I love the graphs and just how simply you kind of highlighted and showed us that detail and that insight. So thanks for that, Jim. We've got a question or two. So and we've got 5 minutes. So let me just jump straight into the first one. It's maybe more of a point made, and there's some questions within that. So Jim, Carl has asked, great presentation, he said, Jim. Scarcity is definitely skills based, but on top of that, we need to add our company's diversity ambitions like gender in the mix. This makes it even more difficult. So just give us your thoughts on that and what people are really up against at the moment.
Yeah, Colin, I completely agree with Carl's sentiment. And I think I said it as I said at the beginning of the presentation, I think scarce talent will probably mean different things to different people. But certainly when we spoke about scarce talent 5 years ago, most of us would have been talking about the very niche skills that we're looking for within our organizations. And within the world of pharma, that was typically kind of medical skills or niche scientific skills. Of course, these days it's far more broad, and we're reading all the time in the news about the lack of lorry drivers and the lack of hospitality workers. So I think scarce skills in general are far more broad than they ever were. And then, of course, layer on top of that the challenges that we then have from a D&I perspective. Layer on top of that potentially some of the challenges that we have when we think about flexible working. And the fact that a lot of our talent is now able to be far more picky about things like work location, work hours. Even I think those kind of scarce talent challenges are exasperated in that regard.
And Jim, I think we've there isn't any other questions in the Q&A, but I've got one that's specifically affected me when I was back at Marriott, where I lost a colleague, and there was nothing I could do to really defend against it. She went back because of the pandemic and during furlough to her parents back in Germany, in Berlin, and realised during that period of time that there were more important things than work, to be fair, and did a complete personal reevaluation. So what are your thoughts on the fact that some talent is lost and it's permanently lost? We're not getting it back. And what are we doing? I'm sure there's loads. I mean, I know there's loads of things we can do right now to try and compete against everyone else. But I really loved your point about recruiting early and trying to get people onto your books ahead of time. I'd love to know a little bit more about your thoughts on that, because we got to start cloning and creating people, right? Because we have lost a huge chunk of our talent audience.
Yeah, I completely agree. As I mentioned in the presentation, I think there are some kind of short to medium term things that we can all be doing that will better help us attract and engage great talent. But the big strategic priorities are much, much more challenging, which is about how do we grow our own talent, then how do we better retain our own talent. And I know that people are sick of the phrase, the great resignation, and a lot of people are debating how long that's going to happen for. But I don't think it's going anytime soon. I think we have a huge amount of inflation coming in. We're seeing a crazily competitive marketplace. And of course, there's this kind of pent up internal mobility where a lot of talent is now ready for a move and now pushing for a move. I think the strategic points about how we better grow our own talent and then how we better retain our own talent through coaching, development, I think are really, really important. And this white paper was done in the context of the pharma life sciences sector, which is a sector that historically has always been incredibly cash rich and able to really invest in growing their own talent. But actually, as I look out across the sector today, there are very few organizations that invest nearly as much as they used to in early talent programs. And I honestly just think that has to be the answer.
It's got to be addressed.
If we're constantly reliant on stealing the best talent from our competitors, strategically, that's not going to work in the long term.
No, it's not. I totally concur. And one of the questions or the additional points I was going to ask you about is, you know, to go early to market, to develop and nurture people to become, you know, our future talent is always an upfront investment. And given the, you know, the sign of the times where you know, businesses are struggling in some cases as well to invest, and you know, prices spiraling. We've got an awful situation ahead where the only way to maybe address our future skills gap is by investing early, but not everyone's got the capacity to do that. So, you know, I think the pandemic has kind of made us realize that, you know, we need to change ways of working. It's also made people realize that they can have flexibility in their workforce, and it's also put pressure financially on so many. It's not an easy fix, right?
It's not an easy fix, but it's really interesting. So you're right. The strategic fix requires some upfront investment, but I don't think the business case for that upfront investment has ever been as strong as it is today. If we look at our payroll costs, you know, with inflation, they're growing exponentially.
Yeah.
We look at the turnover that's increasing, and of course, every time you have to backfill a lever, you've not only got the cost of recruitment, the cost of talent acquisition, you've got the time to productivity. If we can reduce our external hiring by 20% in lieu of greater internal mobility, greater talent retention, if we can reduce our payroll costs by hiring more talent at those entry levels and growing our own talent, that business case is incredible. But it requires people to be able to take a step back and evaluate all of that. And of course, that's easier said than done when, you know, we're all in the midst of this battle for talent.
Yeah, and it's something, Jim, you've probably been advising businesses to do anyway, but they're being forced to do it now, which is, you know, sign of the times. Jim, look, incredible session, fantastic insights there. And the white paper you talk about, is that something that is available to be shared to the audience here, or just the presentation?
Yep, they're both available. I'm not sure if we've uploaded the white paper anywhere, but we can make it available. Otherwise, it can be downloaded from weareams.com.
Wonderful. Jim, thank you so much. That's incredible. Thank you for your time. Thank you for all that insight. On behalf of myself, the audience, and HRCoreLAB, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
That's an absolute pleasure. Now,